Easter or Ishtar by Al Perez. The word Easter appears once in the King James Version of the Bible. Herod has put Peter in prison, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Acts chapter 12, verse 4. Yet in the original Greek text, the word is not Easter, but Pesach, that is, Passover. So why was the name changed? Please read on and remember Exodus chapter 34, verse 14. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Asherah, the Greek form of this word from the Septuagint, is Astarte, who is the Babylonian goddess of the sea being symbolic of people, and consort of the god El. She was the mother of several gods, including Baal, the Babylonian god of the sun. These deities were soon adopted by the Canaanites when they named these female deities the Ashura or Asherim. These deities were made of wood carved from a type of evergreen tree. More often, they were set up in Canaanite homes as full trees cut down from a forest. The Asherim normally were highly acknowledged during two specific occasions. First and foremost, they were the fertility gods of the spring equinox, when the days and nights were approximately the same in length, signifying the beginning of living things growing for the summer season. A very common practice in the Canaanite religion was performed on the first Sunday of the equinox. The families would face east to await the rising of the sun, which was the chief symbol of the sun god, Baal. Later on during the day, the children of the Canaanite parents would often go and hunt for eggs, which were symbolic of sex, fertility, and new life. It was believed that these eggs came from rabbits, which in the pagan world were symbolic of lust, sexual prowess, and reproduction. The Canaanites, however, were not the only ones who worshipped rabbits as deities. The Egyptians and the Persians, who are Babylon, also held rabbits in high esteem because they believed that rabbits first came from the divine phoenix birds who once ruled the ancient skies until they were attacked by other gods in a power struggle. When they were struck down, they reincarnated into rabbits, but kept the ability to produce eggs like the ancient birds to show their origins. Other stories concerning the egg rose later in the Middle Ages by the Anglo-Saxons, where they believed the origin of the universe had the earth being hatched out of an enormous egg. Decorating eggs came about to honor their pagan gods and were often presented as gifts to other families to bring them fertility and sexual success during the coming year. And secondly, they were highly worshipped and celebrated during the winter solstice, as according to Jeremiah chapter 10 verse 1 through 5, Isaiah chapter 40 verse 19 through 20, Isaiah chapter 41 verse 7, and Isaiah chapter 44 verse 9 through 20. The pagans would go out into the forest and do one of two things. Either they chopped down a tree and carved a female deity out of it, or they would simply bring the tree into the house and decorate it with gold and silver ornaments, symbolizing the sun and the moon, while nailing a stand on the bottom so it would not totter or tip over. Out of this practice came many other variations of these pagan festivals until the Roman Catholic Church adopted the Asherah worship and named it Easter around 155 AD. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, Easter was named after a pagan goddess of the Anglo-Saxons named Eostre, the goddess of the dawn. A great controversy arose between the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church in 325 AD on whether to celebrate Easter on Sundays or on whatever day the Jewish Passover fell on. Unfortunately, the Greeks lost a lot of followers, and the Catholics contended that keeping Easter on Sundays would stimulate the practices of both the Christian world and the pagan worshippers. Note that the word Catholic means universal or one world in thought and concept and practice. Hence, the original practice of Asherah worship, we now have in our time the celebration of Easter, a counterfeit holiday to the true Christian festival of the Passover, which was instituted in the Bible and completed in the New Testament when Christ died on the cross as our Passover lamb. For indeed, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. They believed a lie, and now had pleasure in unrighteousness. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. Easter, a day honored by most in contemporary Christianity, is celebration of the resurrection of Christ. Yet, the vast majority of ecclesiastical and secular historians agree that the name of Easter and the traditions surrounding it are deeply rooted in pagan religion. Really? How could this be? What would any of the ways of God have to do with the paganism of ancient Babylon and beyond? And if these roots were really so, why does it still continue today? If the Easter story only stands as a remembrance of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, then it is symbolic of his return from death, a release of the devil's hold on the ancient world. At this time of Easter, Jesus was supposedly accredited as the agent behind the renewal or return of the sinful world Adam helped sink us all into something better. Now, Jesus provided another way, giving the populace a new way to salvation. Yet Easter, as we'll soon see, now seems to be tied more to things which look a lot more pagan overall. The cycle of the seasons, the welcoming of spring, the fertility of the land, etc. Why these associations? What does it all have to do with nature? We'll now see that Easter could, in actuality, be the celebration of a resurrection, rebirth, or return of someone. But who exactly? Let's see. One source claims that the word Easter is of Saxon origin. Istra, the goddess of spring, in whose honor sacrifices were offered. Wow, the goddess of spring. Wasn't this holiday supposed to be about the Son of God? As we dig deeper into this subject, we first need to ask ourselves, who just might this goddess be? Would any woman or goddess have anything to do with the death and the resurrection of Christ? And if she did have some kind of role here, why would she be related to springtime? We now see another, more popular meaning of Easter. It comes from the ancient goddess of pagan Babylon. In Babylonia, the goddess of spring was called Ishtar. And we also see that Ishtar was actually pronounced Istar in most Semitic dialects. So, what would be this day of Ishtar? Ishtar was a day that commemorated the resurrection of one of their ancient Babylonian gods that they called Tammuz, who was believed to be the only begotten son of the sun god. The Pagan Origins of Easter, ND, Part 1, 5. Seems to be more to it all, besides just Ishtar. In the above, we see that there were two other gods here. At least, one was even known as the only begotten son of. Doesn't this sound familiar to many? Jesus was known as the only begotten Son of God, but who was this Tammuz as well? Who was the sun god? Yes, there just might be another story behind our modern day Easter, an ancient one, with parallels to be commemorated in the changes of nature from then on. This may actually be the real roots of our Easter holiday. So, to let the cat out of the bag a little early, here we'll discover that Easter is, in large part, the remembrance of the murder of Nimrod, the pagan builder of the Tower of Babel. See Origins of Babylon, Part 2. As our revealing progresses, we'll also see that Tammuz, or Damuzi, was only another name of this pagan Nimrod, and Ishtar, or Inanna, was actually another name for the Babylonian Semiramis and the sun god. And the sun god, he was none other than the cornerstone god the ancient pagans worshipped. All three, of course, were nothing of Christian origin. This is the actual story. First, as we recall from Origins of Babylon, Part 2. Shem, a son of Noah, actually killed Nimrod and cut his body into little pieces. We recall that he sent a piece of Nimrod to each area dominated by his Babylonian kingdom as a message of fear and compliance. Shem wanted people to turn back to God and get off the Babylonian bandwagon, or else. Nimrod's mother and wife, Semiramis, had to use her noggin during this time, and quickly. She had to come up with something to deflect it all. She also needed a way to maintain her power over the pagan populace at this time of crisis, maybe even accentuate her own significance. It all depended on what kind of story she could cook up and who would buy it, so she needed to come up with a good one. She did it, and here's the way she was able to snake her way into keeping power and control over the despondent Babylonian people with religious hyperbole. After Nimrod, now to be known as Tammuz, was martyred by that evil god lover, Semiramis, now to be known as Inanna or Ishtar, was totally grief stricken. She was so despondent and sad that she was willing to do almost anything to get her slain son back, she must have felt like dying as well. So, in a supernatural or esoteric way, she did just that. She let the whole pagan world know that she had followed him into the underworld. Because of her great love for her son, she pleaded for his return while down in there. With all of these pleas, she began to feel that the spirits or gods of the underworld were judging her as heretical. They may have even killed her while down there and hung her body up on display for all to see. Yet in her absence, something horrible was going on in the world above them. The entire terrestrial earth seemed to be just as sad and despondent as Semiramis was because of this loss, and began to show it by the loss of fertility and life. Crops ceased to grow, animals seemed to stop reproducing, etc. Unless something was to be done, soon in the underworld, the upper natural world above them, and all life on it, might begin to head towards the same dire end as Nimrod. So something had to be done to help her and the entire world out. Semiramis was reportedly inside the underworld for a whole of 3 days. At the end of these days, she sent a desperate message to her pagan gods for help. Finally, one of them, the sun god, felt compassion for her and resurrected them both. He brought both the plants of life and the waters of life to the underworld, and both were permitted to leave it and be brought up to live again. This was her story, and she was sticking to it, but there had to be more to it. Most any pagan of the time probably figured out that Nimrod obviously wasn't a god to them, because he was dead and his body was chopped into little pieces. Obviously, he couldn't rise from the dead on his own in this state. So Semiramis had to continue with a lot more of her supernatural elements to this story to make it all believable. The story continues. After Shem killed Nimrod, Semiramis reportedly wanted to gather all of these strewn body parts and supernaturally put him back together. She was able to gather most of the parts, however, except for one piece, the piece of Nimrod, which was never found, his reproductive organ, his penis. So, according to her, because of the fact that she couldn't find all of the pieces, she said the gods clearly couldn't bring this body back to life. So Nimrod would have to be back in another way, and thanks to the sun god, she would be able to bring Nimrod back as another human being. So the pagan sun god, also known as Baal, Moloch, etc., would, according to her, come down to their physical earth in the form of a flame and cause her to bring forth another Nimrod for all to see. Yes, she claimed, the warming rays of the sun, via the sun god, caused her to immaculately conceive, which allowed her to bring forth a baby, now the reincarnated soul of Nimrod. Now they both would, in an esoteric way, be brought back from the underworld and back up to the earth. Semiramis did become pregnant soon after this, the real father unknown to most. And she now was able to go around claiming her baby was this reborn, renewed, or otherwise reincarnated Nimrod. When the baby was born, it would then be celebrated as a god, as Nimrod, back from the underworld. Now that he came back, Neo-Nimrod would also be given credit as defeating Shem's and his god's attempt at death. Reborn Nimrod was considered savior of the pagan world because he was the one able to break the hold of God's death on the world and keep the false faith of the pagan populace alive. This all occurred during the time period of what would be, and from then on, celebrated as the first pagan Easter. So, to create an annual celebration of this event, the festival of Ishtar, or Easter, became the commemoration of this conception of Semiramis, her claims for creating a new beginning for her pagan populace, her renewing the world at hand through Neo-Nimrod, and her reviving, updating the ancient pagan religion they once had in so many ways. She was accredited for adding any of these new reviving elements of an otherwise questionable religion at the time, morphing it into a deeper, more complex mystery religion of Babylon as well. With the help of these new esoteric religions elements, she was able not only to relive the problem of Nimrod's death, but also to elevate herself as the most important goddess to it all. This is where the nature goddess of the post-flood world comes into play. Also, many symbols of nature we see around us, especially those pertaining to rejuvenation or rebirth, are also brought into play here as part of the celebration. The light of the sun becomes symbolic of the sun god's power. The rejuvenating time of spring becomes symbolic of this conception or revival of the major god of paganism. None of it, of course, is about the revival of Jesus Christ. All of this becomes compressed into a single holiday, the time of Easter. The supernatural, esoteric story and all of the symbolism surrounding it needed to continue on a little further, though Neo-Nimrod's supernatural stay on this earth, however, as another child of Semiramis, would not be permanent, at least in the body he was about to receive. The soon-to-be son of Semiramis would have to die, eventually, as any other human would. But that wouldn't really matter. He, according to these Babylonian elites, such as Semiramis, was still Neo-Nimrod, and Nimrod was still their supernatural savior. He would live on in God form, no matter if he was in the form of a human body or no. So, to explain things a little further, there had to be a bit more to Semiramis' supernatural story, at least in regards to how it all was to be celebrated here on Earth. Sometime after the time Semiramis and Nimrod were granted their time back on Earth, at the time of Easter, Nimrod, or Tammuz, would have to leave this earthly abode and go back into the underworld, at least for a little while. That was part of the sun god's plan. So, just as reborn Nimrod, her son, had to physically die, the god within him was still considered as God and would continue on forever. This would be commemorated in our natural world too, providing evidence of this birth, death, rebirth pattern. And it was manifested for the people through the changing cycles of the seasons. What are we saying here? We're saying that in our natural world around us, the ancient pagan elites began to claim that there were pointers to the truth of this whole supernatural esoteric story. We were already beginning to discover these pointers were seen through seasonal changes, the cycles of the seasons. Spring and autumn would both be dictated as the times to celebrate Nimrod and the changes he had to go through. Easter and all the things that revolve around the time of spring would be celebrated as Nimrod's revival, because it obviously was, paired with reviving warmth of the sun, the newness of spring, fertility, new life, etc. All physical, worldly proofs of this world revived. Nimrod's story, according to them. The same would work in the autumn period, with physical proofs of his return back to the underworld. See the Halloween connection. The ancient pagans could, then, be continually convinced of Semiramis' esoteric story here throughout the year by connecting all of these things they saw changing around them. That's why the changing of the seasons and spring are vitally connected to the holiday of Easter. It all seemed to take on a life of its own with these ancients when they looked around them, because Semiramis first proclaimed itself. Coming up, we'll also learn more about the time Nimrod, that is, Tammuz, had to go back to the underworld and how that was also set into place, how it was established and celebrated during the time of autumn. See the Halloween connection. So Easter, from then on, was commemorated as the time of rebirth, renewal, or reincarnation of a major pagan god. He was brought back to life to prove to the world that he was the one who conquered death, and that his pagan ways were the right ways a person should use for their salvation, not Christ. Yet, if we think about it, why shouldn't the pagans around her believe her story? So much of it seemed to be happening all around them, just taking on a life of its own. Again, that's why the festival of Easter, or Ishtar, is intertwined with the prevailing themes of fertility, renewal, a descent into darkness, and the triumph of light over darkness, or rather God's darkness, as well as some triumph of good over evil, or rather God's evil. The story of Jesus and this epic Semiramis, or Ishtar, Inanna, did have some things possibly in common, but the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection seemed the one structured and embellished in accordance with a pattern that was very ancient and widespread. In other words, Jesus' entire story was hijacked by the ancient pagans of Babylon and copied somewhat 2,000 years before his birth. Today, we see a secular culture celebrating the spring equinox, whilst religious culture celebrates the resurrection. However, early Christianity made a pragmatic acceptance of ancient pagan practices, most of which we enjoy today at Easter. The general symbolic story of the death of the sun, or as we look in the sky, the sun, and his rebirth, overcoming the powers of darkness, was a well-worn story in the ancient world. The Pagan Roots of Easter, 2010, page 1, paragraph 8. So now we see the holiday of Easter really comes from Babylon spreading out, first to the various nations or empires of the world, such as Egypt, which sprout up their own versions later. From there, it spread to the ends of the earth. But wait, could this all really be so? Could the majority of what well-wishing Christians celebrate at this time really come from something totally foreign? Could Jesus' resurrection from the dead really be something of a compromise holiday, first pagan, then adopted as Christian? As we look further, we'll discover some of the more popular elements of Easter and see how so much of it was and still is of pagan origin, having nothing to do with the resurrection of Christianity's Lord and Savior.